Today, a Porsche 911 Turbo S represents the absolute pinnacle of automotive engineering. 0 to 60 in 2.6 seconds, a $250,000 testament to German precision. But here's what the marketing brochures will never tell you. Every single Porsche vehicle traces its bloodline back to a handshake between two men in a Berlin hotel suite on June 22, 1934. One was Ferdinand Porsche, a 59-year-old engineering genius who had already revolutionized the automotive industry. The other was Adolf Hitler, who had been in power for exactly 17 months. What Hitler wanted that day was simple yet unprecedented. A car for the German people. The Volkswagen, the people's car. A vehicle so affordable that every Aryan family could own one. 500 Reichsmarks, he insisted, the price of a modest motorcycle. It was an impossible specification. In 1934, the cheapest car in Germany cost 1,300 Reichsmarks. Henry Ford's Model T had revolutionized American industry, but even Ford's economies of scale couldn't hit Hitler's target price. But Ferdinand Porsche didn't see an impossible dream. He saw the opportunity of a lifetime. For 3 decades, Porsche had been the man behind the engineering breakthroughs that no one else could solve. At Austro-Daimler, he'd created the world's first gasoline-electric hybrid vehicle in 1900 when he was just 25 years old. At Mercedes-Benz, his supercharged racing engines had dominated Grand Prix circuits throughout the 1920s. But Porsche had never built a car under his own name. He'd never had the resources, the backing, or the political leverage to realize his vision of lightweight, air-cooled efficiency. Hitler was offering something infinitely more valuable than money. State resources on a scale that made private industry look trivial. Unlimited access to Germany's industrial capacity. Government funding with no oversight. And something else, something that Porsche the engineer tried not to think about too carefully. The complete suspension of workers' rights, environmental regulations, and every other constraint that made mass production expensive. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Porsche had a contract to develop 3 prototypes within 10 months. The Reich would fund everything. There was just one condition, unstated but absolutely understood. This wasn't just about building cars. This was about building the industrial infrastructure for total war. The factories that would produce the people's car would be designed from day one to convert instantly to military production. The lightweight, air-cooled engine that Porsche was promising. It would need to power scout vehicles, amphibious transports, and eventually weapon systems that hadn't even been conceived yet. Ferdinand Porsche walked out of the Kaiserhout Hotel that evening as the Third Reich's official automotive architect. Within 6 years, his People's Car factory would become the largest automotive manufacturing facility on Earth. Within 9 years, it would be staffed almost entirely by slave labor from concentration camps. And within 11 years, Allied bombers would reduce it to rubble, killing thousands of forced workers who had built Hitler's war machine. But that June evening in 1934, all Ferdinand Porsche could see was his dream finally within reach. The question that would haunt his legacy for the next 90 years. Did he know what he was really agreeing to? Or did he simply refuse to look? The technical challenge Hitler handed Porsche was genuinely revolutionary, and that's what made it so seductive. Build a car that weighs under 1,000 pounds. Make it air-cooled so it never needs antifreeze in Russian winters. Power it with a rear-mounted engine for maximum traction on unpaved roads. Keep it simple enough that a farmer with no mechanical training could maintain it. And do all of this for 500 Reichsmarks. It was the engineering equivalent of being asked to build a spaceship using only bicycle parts. Porsche's solution was genuinely brilliant, and it proved he was every bit the engineering genius his reputation suggested. He rejected the conventional front-engine water-cooled layout that every other manufacturer considered mandatory. Instead, he designed a flat-four boxer engine that sat behind the rear axle. The cylinders opposed each other horizontally, which meant the engine was naturally balanced and generated minimal vibration. Air cooling eliminated the radiator, water pump, and entire cooling system, saving weight, cost, and complexity. The suspension was pure innovation. Torsion bars instead of leaf springs. Imagine a steel bar twisted lengthwise, using its resistance to twisting as the suspension medium. It was lighter, simpler, and more durable than any coil spring system. The body was a revolutionary unibody design that didn't need a separate frame. The floor pan was the structure. Everything about the Type 1, as Porsche designated it, was engineered to be manufactured cheaply, serviced easily, and operated reliably under conditions that would destroy a conventional automobile. The engine displacement was exactly 985 cubic centimeters, or just under 1 liter. At 3,300 revolutions per minute, it produced 23.5 horsepower. That sounds pathetic by modern standards, but remember, this engine weighed just 110 pounds, complete with all accessories. A comparable water-cooled inline-four of the era weighed 280 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio was actually competitive. More importantly, the torque curve was remarkably flat. The boxer configuration meant that each piston's motion was directly opposed by another piston moving in the opposite direction. This created perfect primary balance without needing balance shafts or counterweights. The result was an engine that could idle smoothly at 600 RPM and pull strongly from 1500 RPM all the way to its 3700 RPM red line. For a vehicle designed to operate on dirt roads and cart paths, low-end torque mattered far more than peak horsepower. The air cooling system was equally clever. Each cylinder had deep cooling fins machined into the castings, increasing surface area by a factor of 12. A belt-driven fan mounted directly on the crankshaft forced air through a shroud that directed cooling air over each cylinder and head. The system was self-regulating. Engine speed automatically increased fan speed, which increased cooling exactly when it was needed most. There were no thermostats, no coolant passages, no opportunities for leaks or freezing. In testing, Porsche's prototypes maintained stable operating temperatures from -40 degrees Celsius in alpine conditions to +50 degrees in artificial desert testing. By 1936, Porsche had 3 working prototypes. They performed flawlessly. Hitler personally test drove one of them and declared it perfect. But here's where the People's Car project reveals its true purpose. In October 1937, Hitler ordered the construction of a massive new factory complex. Not an expansion of existing facilities. Not a partnership with established manufacturers like Opel or Daimler. An entirely new city built from nothing in the middle of nowhere. The location chosen was a tract of empty heathland near the village of Fallersleben in Lower Saxony. Hitler named the new city Stadt des KdF-Wagen, City of the Strength Through Joy car. The car's official name was now the KdF-Wagen, after Kraft durch Freude, the Nazi leisure organization that was supposedly democratizing German recreation. 20,000 workers would live in this new city. The factory itself would be larger than Ford's River Rouge complex in Detroit. Planned capacity, 1.5 million vehicles per year by 1942. To put that in perspective, the entire German automobile industry in 1937 produced 330,000 vehicles total. Hitler was proposing to build a single factory that would quintuple Germany's automotive output. The architectural plans were staggering in their ambition. The main assembly hall would measure 480 meters long and 60 meters wide, nearly a third of a mile of continuous production line under one roof. The steel press shop would house the largest automotive presses ever constructed, capable of stamping complete floor pans in a single stroke. The foundry would cast 2,000 engine blocks per day. There would be a dedicated power station generating 150 megawatts. Worker housing would accommodate families in modern apartments with indoor plumbing and central heating, luxuries that most German workers in 1937 could only dream of. The entire complex would be a model Nazi city, demonstrating that Nazi ideology could deliver prosperity and modernity to the German people. Groundbreaking occurred on May 26th, with Hitler personally laying the ceremonial cornerstone. 12,000 construction workers labored around the clock. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and began World War II, the factory was 60% complete. But here's the detail that reveals everything. The factory floor layout included quick-change tooling stations designed for rapid conversion between civilian and military production. The press shops could switch from stamping curved beetle fenders to flat military body panels in less than 4 hours. The assembly lines included overhead gantries rated for lifting armored components. The paint shops had ventilation systems designed to handle military primer and camouflage finishes. Every aspect of the People's Car factory was dual use from conception. There's just one problem. The People's Car was never meant for the people. The famous savings stamp program, where German workers could buy stamps each week to eventually earn their KdF-Wagen, collected 280 million Reichsmarks from 336,000 Germans. That's roughly $1.4 billion in today's money. Not one civilian ever received their car. Not one. The entire program was a financial scam that funneled private savings directly into military infrastructure. Because by the time the factory was operational in May 1940, Germany had been at war for 8 months. The Type 1 civilian vehicle never entered mass production. Instead, the production lines immediately began manufacturing military variants. The Wehrmacht had been waiting. In November 1938, the Heer's Weapons Testing Office had issued specification requirements for a light reconnaissance vehicle. The official designation was leichter geländegängiger Personenkraftwagen, light cross-country passenger car. The requirements were brutally specific. Maximum weight 950 kilograms. Minimum ground clearance 300 millimeters. Capable of maintaining 80 kilometers per hour on paved roads, 40 kilometers per hour cross-country, fording depth 500 millimeters, climbing gradient 30 degrees. The vehicle needed to carry 4 soldiers with full combat equipment and function reliably in temperatures from -40 to +50 degrees Celsius. And the Wehrmacht wanted it immediately. Porsche delivered the military solution in less than 4 months. The Type 82, officially designated Kübelwagen, bucket seat car, or simply Kübelwagen. It shared 50% of its components with the Type 1 civilian platform. Same 985cc flat-4 engine, same torsion bar suspension, same transmission and final drive. But the body was now a lightweight military shell designed by Porsche's engineering team at the newly formed Volkswagenwerk GmbH, the corporate entity that would become today's Volkswagen AG. Let's talk about why the Kübelwagen was so effective, because the technical details matter. This wasn't just another military vehicle. This was a machine that fundamentally changed Wehrmacht tactical doctrine, and understanding how it worked explains why Porsche's designs became so essential to Nazi military operations, which in turn explains why the company became so dependent on forced labor to meet production demands. The Kübelwagen Type 82 weighed exactly 705 kilograms empty, or 1,554 pounds. For comparison, the American Willys MB Jeep weighed 1,113 kilograms, 2,453 pounds. That's a 408-kilogram difference, nearly 900 pounds. In engineering terms, that's enormous. Every kilogram matters when you're operating on dirt roads, sand, mud, or no roads at all. The Kübelwagen's ground clearance was exactly 290 millimeters, 11.4 inches. The Jeep's was 220 millimeters, 8.7 inches. That 70-millimeter advantage meant the Kübelwagen could clear obstacles that would ground the Jeep. The rear engine weight distribution was even more extreme than the civilian Type 1. 68% of the vehicle's weight was over the rear axle, where the driven wheels were located. Simple physics: more weight on the driven wheels equals more traction. When you're clawing through sand or mud, weight distribution beats horsepower every single time. But here's where Porsche's design became genuinely revolutionary. The Kübelwagen had no four-wheel drive system, none. It was rear-wheel drive only with an open differential. Every engineer in every army assumed you needed four-wheel drive for serious off-road capability. The Jeep had it with a two-speed transfer case. The Soviet Gaz-67 had it. The British had developed four-wheel drive scout cars based on pre-war civilian chassis. But Porsche proved them all wrong. The Kübelwagen's combination of lightweight, extreme rear weight bias, high ground clearance, and clever gearing gave it off-road capability that matched or exceeded four-wheel drive vehicles that were 50% heavier. The secret was in three components: the limited slip differential, the reduction hubs, and the tire specification. The ZF limited slip differential used a cam and pawl mechanism that would lock when one wheel lost traction, forcing power to the wheel with grip. It wasn't a full locker. It allowed some speed differential for cornering, but it was far more effective than an open differential. The reduction hubs were essentially planetary gear sets mounted at each rear wheel, providing a 20% reduction in final drive ratio. This gave the Kübelwagen the low-speed torque multiplication of a much larger engine without the weight penalty of a two-speed transfer case. And then there were the tires. Porsche specified 5.25 by 16 tires, inflated to just 1.4 bar, about 20 psi. For reference, modern passenger car tires run at 32 to 35 psi. The low pressure created an enormous contact patch and allowed the tire to deform around obstacles. The tires were essentially acting as supplemental suspension, conforming to the terrain rather than fighting it. In sand, the wide, soft tires distributed the vehicle's weight over a much larger area, reducing ground pressure. In mud, they provided mechanical grip through sheer surface area. The combination was devastatingly effective. Wehrmacht field reports from the 1940 Battle of France noted that Kübelwagens were keeping pace with tracked motorcycles across farmland and logging roads. In the North African campaign starting in 1941, Kübelwagens outperformed tracked vehicles in pure desert sand. The air cooling was crucial. A single bullet through a radiator would strand a water-cooled vehicle in the middle of nowhere with no recovery possible. The Kübelwagen could take multiple hits to the engine compartment and keep running. Field mechanics discovered they could swap a complete engine in 47 minutes using basic tools and a portable crane. For comparison, replacing a Jeep's inline-4 engine required 3 to 4 hours and more specialized equipment. Erwin Rommel, commanding the Afrika Corps, specifically requisitioned additional Kübelwagens for his reconnaissance units. His after-action reports praised their reliability and speed in desert navigation. By the end of 1941, standard Wehrmacht doctrine had evolved. Kübelwagens were the primary reconnaissance vehicle for infantry divisions, with motorcycle combinations relegated to secondary roads and communications duties. The demand was exponential. In 1940, the Volkswagenwerk factory produced 4,500 Kübelwagens. In 1941, 15,755 units. In 1942, 25,513 units. By 1943, production had ramped to 32,000 yearly. The factory was running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's when the forced labor began in earnest. To hit these production targets required a workforce of over 15,000 people in final assembly alone, plus thousands more in the component supply chain. But Germany's military-age male population was being consumed by the Eastern Front. The casualties were staggering. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union beginning June 1941, cost the Wehrmacht 830,000 casualties in the first 6 months. Every available German man was either in uniform or working in critical war industries. There simply weren't enough workers. The solution from the Nazi regime's perspective was obvious: forced labor. Concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, civilians from occupied territories given the choice between factory work or starvation. By 1942, the Volkswagenwerk factory workforce was 30% forced labor. By 1943, 50% forced labor. By 1944, over 65% forced labor. Approximately 13,000 forced laborers were working in the Wolfsburg factory complex at the program's peak. They weren't volunteers. They weren't paid meaningful wages. They were slaves, working under armed guard, beaten if they failed to meet production quotas, and dying of exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease by the thousands. And then Porsche did something even more audacious. In early 1941, the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command issued a new requirement. They needed an amphibious reconnaissance vehicle. Rivers were everywhere in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The spring thaw turned entire regions into flooded marshland. The Wehrmacht needed a vehicle that could ford rivers and lakes under its own power. Most engineers would have started from scratch. Porsche did the opposite. He took the same basic Type 1 platform, the same flat-4 engine, the same torsion bar suspension, the same rear engine.
By late 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had exacted a brutal toll. The Wehrmacht suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, creating a catastrophic labor vacuum in German industry. Factories across the Reich, including Ferdinand Porsche's prized Volkswagenwerk, could no longer meet quotas with German labor alone. The solution, mandated by the Nazi regime, was to turn the city of the KdF-Wagens into a hub of industrialized human exploitation. Volkswagenwerk became one of the largest users of forced labor in the entire Nazi war machine. They came in waves, classified by the regime to determine their fate. First, prisoners of war, POWs, primarily Soviets, who, contrary to the Geneva Conventions, were pressed into factory service and stripped of their basic rights. Then came the Ostarbeiter, civilians abducted from occupied eastern territories, mainly Ukraine and Poland. They were considered racially inferior and marked by special patches, granted the bare minimum of caloric intake, and subjected to round-the-clock surveillance. Finally, the darkest element: concentration camp prisoners, transferred from camps like Neuengamme, identifiable by their striped uniforms. This workforce wasn't a choice, it was a necessity for a factory running 24 hours a day. This vast pool of unfree labor solved Porsche's production paradox: how to build 50,000 military vehicles annually when every able-bodied German man was at the front. The factory's capacity, once intended to symbolize Nazi prosperity, now symbolized its cruelty. The production lines of the Kübelwagen were manned by a silent army of slaves, operating under the eyes of the Werkschutz, factory guards, who held the power of life and death. The shift from voluntary labor to forced labor was not a gradual event. It was a systematic conversion of industrial logistics into organized terror. To truly understand the ethical cost, one must look beyond the total numbers and examine the operational reality. By 1944, the Volkswagenwerk workforce comprised approximately 20,000 individuals, of whom roughly 13,000 were forced laborers, a stunning 65% of the total. These workers lived in a state of permanent attrition. Their shifts were brutal: 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, on starvation rations. The standard diet was typically below 1,000 calories per day, designed not for sustainability but for exhaustion and eventual replacement, a concept the SS termed extermination through work. The factory managers, tasked with hitting the Wehrmacht's constantly escalating quotas, viewed the laborers as expendable inputs. Accidents were frequent, sanitation was non-existent, and medical care was actively denied. If an Ostarbeiter fell ill or injured himself, he was not moved to a hospital. He was often returned to the barracks to die, or sent back to the concentration camp to be replaced. Production engineering and human cruelty became two sides of the same coin. The very efficiency that Ferdinand Porsche was obsessed with, the simplification of components, the quick engine swaps, meant the production line could churn out vehicles despite the high rate of labor turnover and mortality. The numbers are haunting. Between 1942 and 1945, a conservative estimate places the number of deaths within the Wolfsburg facility and its satellite plants at least 4,000 forced laborers. The site eventually housed its own crematorium, a stark, undeniable symbol of the factory's dual purpose. This was not a side effect of war. It was the intended consequence of a system engineered for relentless, profit-driven production. And Ferdinand Porsche, the man whose face adorned the technical specifications, was there. Records show both he and his son, Ferry Porsche, were frequent visitors to the plant, reviewing production logs and inspecting the line. They saw the Ostarbeiter, they saw the POWs, and they saw the striped uniforms of the Neuengamme prisoners. To claim ignorance would be an act of willful historical negligence. The engineering genius that created the Kübelwagen is inextricably tied to the ethical failure that accepted its production cost in human lives.
As the war turned decisively against Germany following Stalingrad, Ferdinand Porsche's involvement escalated from light reconnaissance to the heaviest weapon systems. In 1942, Hitler tasked Porsche with developing a new heavy tank, the VK-45.01P, intended to be the superior counterpart to the famous Tiger I. Porsche's design was characteristically brilliant but overly complex. It used a revolutionary gas-electric drive system that eliminated the need for a mechanical transmission, utilizing two massive generators to power electric motors at the tracks. In theory, the electric drive offered smooth power delivery and immense torque. In practice, the system was plagued by reliability issues, consuming enormous amounts of copper, a critical wartime material, and frequently catching fire. When the VK-45.01P was rejected in favor of the Henschel design, Porsche had already built 91 fully complete chassis. The loss would have financially crippled a private company. But Porsche was not a private company. He was an architect of the Reich. Hitler, still trusting Porsche's name over his failure, ordered the repurposing of these 91 chassis. They were converted into the Panzerjäger Tiger P, commonly known as the Ferdinand, later renamed Elefant. This monstrous tank destroyer featured an 88mm PaK-43 cannon and weighed 65 tons, making it the largest armored vehicle to carry the Porsche designation. The massive box-like design was essentially a giant armored turret wrapped around Porsche's complex, failed electric drive system. It was the epitome of the Nazi regime, taking a technological failure and demanding its success through brute force and overwhelming scale. The creation of the Elefant cemented Porsche's role not just as a supplier of mobile vehicles, but as a central designer of front-line armored destruction. This escalation was the final, full acceptance of the war machine, preparing the ground for the inescapable moral reckoning that would follow the war's end. The war machine collapsed faster than anyone predicted. By April 1945, the Wolfsburg factory was liberated by American forces, and the full extent of the forced labor system was revealed. As the dust settled and the Nazi hierarchy dissolved, Ferdinand Porsche, the engineer, the visionary, the architect of the people's car, fled south with his family to Gmünd, Austria. But the reckoning was unavoidable. The French government, reeling from the years of occupation, had a specific target: individuals responsible for the exploitation of French labor and the design of military systems used against them. On December 15, 1945, Ferdinand Porsche, his son Ferry, and his son-in-law Anton Piech were arrested by French authorities. The charges were specific: collaboration with the Nazi regime, exploitation of labor, and the development of the Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen used by occupying forces. They were transported to a prison outside Paris, where they faced 2 years of internment while their cases were investigated. The man who had dined with Hitler and designed the world's most advanced armor was now sharing a cell, awaiting trial for war crimes. For the family, this moment of crisis became the genesis of the modern Porsche company. Ferry Porsche, released early, faced a daunting choice: abandon the family name or fight for its survival. He chose the latter. While Ferdinand remained imprisoned, Ferry and his sister Louise Piech, Anton Piech's wife, used their technical knowledge and remaining contacts to continue consulting and designing. Their technical prowess, ironically, became the family's only currency. The French government, despite the charges, desperately needed engineering talent for their post-war auto industry. This financial leverage, the payment of a massive consultation fee for Ferdinand's release, is what ultimately secured his freedom in 1947.
Ferdinand Porsche walked out of prison in 1947, a broken man in his 70s, yet his mind was still dominated by engineering. He returned to Gmund, where his small team, led by Ferry, had already completed a miracle. Using the residual funds from consulting work and the engineering concepts of the Type 1, the rear-engined air-cooled boxer design, they created the first vehicle to officially bear the family name, the Porsche 356. The 356 was essentially the spiritual successor to the KdF-Wagen, but stripped of its political baggage and refined for performance. It was still rear-engined and air-cooled, but the original 985cc engine was bored out and tuned for more power. The first prototype, the 356/1, a mid-engined roadster, was built entirely in the Gmund workshop, largely by hand, using available aluminum for the body panels. It was a humble beginning, but the DNA was unmistakable. Lightweight construction, innovative suspension, and uncompromising technical detail. The 356 was immediately successful. It won its first race in Austria in 1948, proving the lightweight design could deliver performance far beyond its small engine size. This proved a vital point. The core engineering philosophy developed under the regime was independently brilliant. It was the system, not the science, that was evil. This narrative allowed the family to slowly separate the technical genius from the moral complicity. The 356 became the vehicle for their rehabilitation, a symbol of ingenuity that allowed the world to look past the shadows of Wolfsburg. Ferdinand Porsche died in 1951, never having witnessed the global success of his namesake brand. But the legacy he left was a paradox that defines the company to this day. On one hand, the 911, the direct descendant of the 356 and the Kübelwagen's air-cooled philosophy, became the most iconic and successful sports car ever made. This technical line of succession is undeniable. On the other hand, the company spent decades actively suppressing the history of its Nazi involvement, rarely addressing the debt owed to the 13,000 forced laborers who built their foundation. It wasn't until decades later, under intense public pressure and historical review, that Volkswagen and Porsche finally commissioned independent studies to address the role of forced labor, and made official gestures of apology and financial compensation. The question posed at the beginning remains: how do we reconcile the engineering genius with the moral horror? The Porsche saga demonstrates that great technological leaps can be achieved under the most despicable moral conditions. The P-47 Thunderbolt story was about American industrial might defeating tactical brilliance. The Porsche story is about engineering brilliance surviving moral defeat. It shows how the same technical efficiency that optimized a wartime death machine can be repackaged and revered as a symbol of luxury and freedom. It is a powerful reminder that behind every great brand and every great innovation, there is a history, and sometimes that history is built on a terrible, unspeakable cost.